So I'm going to read just a little bit from the very beginning of Cartwheel, and then maybe, depending on time, although I guess there's no clock, maybe a little bit from a second chapter. But the first section I'm going to read is just the very beginning of the book, so I don't think it really requires any setup. This is Andrew, the father of Lily, a young woman who's been arrested for the murder of her roommate while on study abroad in Argentina, and this is Andrew arriving in Argentina to try to help out. Chapter 1, February. Andrew's plane landed at Easy E as promised at 7 a.m. local time. Outside the window, the sun was a hideous orb, bleeding orange light through wavering heat. Andrew was still woozy from his 2 Valiums and 2 glasses of wine, the bare minimum that he needed to fly these days, to anywhere, for anything, though especially for here, for this. The irony of being a professor of international relations who was terrified of international travel was not lost on him. No irony was lost on him ever, but it could not be helped. Neither could it be mitigated by the knowledge, always understood but now finally believed, that the things that go wrong are rarely the things you've thought to worry about. Andrew patted Anna on the shoulder, and she roused herself. He watched her forget and then remember what was happening. He was glad he didn't have to remind her. She pulled her iPod headphones out of her ears, and Andrew caught snatches of some ambient, low-key music. The music of the day was so bloodless, he often thought. Didn't these kids want anything, and weren't they mad at anybody? Before she thumbed it quiet. Anna had endured the trip reasonably well. Her sensible hair was limp in a ponytail. Her nautical stripes, so favored by his students these days, were barely creased. She wore her competence lightly. She didn't know how terrifying it was to him. "Dad," she said, "you need to blink." Andrew blinked painfully. "Does your corneal abrasion hurt?" she said. "No," he said. "It always hurt." He had poked himself in the eye during class one day while making a particularly vigorous point about Russian cyber terrorism in Estonia, and he'd had to go to the ER for a local eyeball anesthetic. Now his eye hurt every morning, every flight, every time he was tired or stressed, which he always would be now for the foreseeable future. "Will we see Lily today?" said Anna. Andrew licked his lips. His eyeballs were so dry that he thought they might tear. The Argentina flights from the East Coast went only once a day, and only from D.C., and it was impossible to get to D.C. in less than 7 hours, no matter how you looked at it. Andrew could not, he reminded himself, have gotten here any earlier. "Probably not today," he said. "Will Mom see her when she comes?" "Hopefully." Andrew's voice cracked, and Anna looked at him alarmed. "Hopefully," he said again, to show her that the crack had been fatigue, not emotion. Outside it was summer, as Andrew had known but secretly not entirely believed that it would be. Anna shimmied out of her jacket, her nose crinkling at the smell of gasoline. Inside the airport, the terminal thrummed with travelers. Andrew offered to buy Anna a soda, then rescinded this offer when he spotted the newspaper outside the kiosk. He didn't have much Spanish beyond what one absorbed through cultural osmosis and a general familiarity with Latinate words, but it was uncomfortably easy to get the gist of the headlines whether he wanted to or not. Andrew wished desperately to keep Anna away from the newspapers. She knew the contours of the accusation, of course, but Andrew had managed, or thought he'd managed, to protect her from the worst of it. The coverage was only just beginning to leak over to the U.S. anyway, and Andrew had spent long hours on the internet looking for the stories, the depictions of Lily as hypersexual, unstable, amoral, the lurid intimations about her romantic jealousy and rage, the accounts of her smug and towering atheism. The fact that she hadn't cried, not after Katie was killed, and not during the interrogations either. The internet had harped on this so much that Andrew had found himself shouting, "She's not a crier, she's just not a fucking crier," into the computer. And finally, the worst, most militantly misunderstood information of all. The fact that a delivery truck driver had seen Lily running from the house with blood on her face the day after the murder. No matter that she'd been the one to find Katie, no matter that she'd been the one to kneel over her and try to administer brave and futile CPR. The news reporters weren't bothering with that information, and Andrew didn't expect them to start. He was beginning to understand what story they were trying to tell. Announcing that the sodas would be better outside the airport, Andrew maneuvered Anna, rather deftly, he thought, toward baggage claim, where they waited for 15 minutes in silence. In wrestling the suitcase off the conveyor belt, Andrew accidentally stomped on the foot of an androgynous teenager. "Permiso," he muttered to the teenager, who was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Sorry for partying." Beside him, Andrew could feel Anna stiffen. Andrew liked to at least know how to apologize wherever he went, but Anna hated it when he tried to speak any language other than English. 2 summers ago, in a different lifetime, Andrew had spent 3 months doing research in Bratislava. His area was emerging post-Soviet democracies, though his job got a little less interesting the more fully the democracies emerged. And afterward, the girls had met him in Prague for a week of castles and bridges and beer. Anna had flinched every time he opened his mouth to deploy some phrase he remembered from his 3 semesters of college Czech. "Dad," she'd said, "they speak English." "Well, I speak Czech." "No, you don't." And so on. Lily, on the other hand, had made him teach her as much Czech as he could, and had then thrown it around willy-nilly, mispronounced, absurd, chirping informal greetings at storekeepers who tended to smile at her, even though she was basically insulting them, because she was so obviously well-intentioned. Andrew used to imagine that Lily's general goodwill, the buoyancy with which she addressed her life, was easily detectable by all people of the world, and that it would protect her. It seemed now that this was not the case. In the taxi, Andrew and Anna passed fruit stands, dingy-looking bars, backfiring motorcycles. The roads were medium good. The infrastructure in general seemed decent. Out the window, Andrew saw satellite dishes wedged improbably between houses, looking like the detritus of abandoned spaceships. He saw a large compound, walled and razor-wired, manned by 2 security guards with walkie-talkies. He craned his neck to see if it was the prison, but it turned out to only be a housing development. "Nothing's open," said Anna. She was looking out her own window and did not turn around. "It's Sunday," said Andrew, "a very Catholic country." "It's too bad that Latin America is in your area." Andrew stared at the back of Anna's head. She had lately taken to making inscrutable declarative statements and studied neutral tones. Andrew desperately hoped that this was not the onset of irony. "You might get some work done, I mean," she said. "I don't know about that." Andrew was suddenly nauseous, awash with their strange new calamity. There was, of course, no possibility that Lily had actually been involved in any of this. Andrew's confidence on that point was part of what had made the situation seem, initially, not catastrophic. The accusation was so ghastly and so wild and so patently, transparently ludicrous that he'd nearly laughed when he first heard of it. Not that there weren't a few things he could imagine Lily getting justly arrested for. Before she had left, he and Maureen had had a series of sober conversations with her about the harshness of Latin American drug laws mostly, as well as the laxity of Latin American sexual safety standards. They'd sent her off with an enormous box of Trojans, industrial-sized, Andrew thought, issued for health clinics or music festivals, no doubt. A box that size could not possibly be intended for the use of a single human being. Andrew reeled to think of how much sex his daughter would have to run through all of them. Nevertheless, he had bravely and maturely had the conversation alongside Maureen. Such was their commitment to pragmatism, such was their commitment to co-parenting, and then bravely and maturely sent Lily off with the box. And Andrew had worried about Lily constantly. He worried about her being kidnapped, trafficked, impregnated, sexually assaulted, afflicted with some horrible STD, arrested for marijuana use, converted to Catholicism, wooed by a long-lashed man with a Vespa. He worried she'd make too few friends. Then he worried she'd make too many. He worried that her GPA would suffer. He worried about her bug bites. He worried so much that when there came a call from Maureen on his work phone in the middle of the day, her voicemail left in a strangled half whisper, Andrew could taste metal in his mouth, so certain was he that something life-altering had happened. And when he heard Lily was in jail, his mind flooded with grim visions of drug use and anti-Americanism and political points to be scored. He could imagine how she'd look to everyone, naive, entitled, no doubt, and he could easily imagine the incentive for punishing her harshly. So when the accusation turned out not to be drugs, not drugs or fair jumping on the metro, did Buenos Aires even have a metro? Or trespassing through someone's field while looking at the stars, or any one of the countless thoughtless crimes that he could believe his daughter might have committed, Andrew was mostly relieved. An accusation of murder was outrageous to the point of being comic, and thus was no great threat. Andrew had tried to communicate some of this feeling to Lily on the telephone when she'd finally been allowed to call. "Don't worry," he had said over the terrible connection. It seemed absolutely vital that Lily know she did not have to tell them she had not done it. Her innocence and eventual acquittal must be the unspoken premises of all their interactions, to be referenced in passing perhaps, but never formally declared. "I know," he'd said, "we all know." Mordantly, from a great distance, she'd said, "Know what?" How am I doing on time? Should I stop there or do I have a little more? Yeah, okay. Well, I will read then just a couple of very short sections then from chapter 2. So since you've heard from the point of view of a character who's firmly convinced of Lily's innocence, I thought I'd give you a little bit from a character who's equally firmly convinced of her guilt. So this is the point of view of Eduardo, who's the prosecutor in the case. Eduardo Campos was not sure until he saw the pictures. Later, people would ask him, informally, socially, when he knew. Be honest with us, they'd say, we won't tell. We knew when we heard about her Facebook page. We knew when we heard about her cartwheel. We knew when we saw the footage of her with the condoms, that cold, seductive look she gave the boy, and only hours after that poor other girl was knifed to death. That's when we knew Lily Hayes was guilty. When did you know? And Eduardo would laugh and say that of course he never knew, that he still didn't know. His job was only to make the case for the state, and the state's case, one had to admit, was ironclad. But the truth was he did know, and he had first known when the judicial police brought him Lily Hayes' camera. The crime scene had not surprised him. Nothing surprised him, really, though there was certainly an incongruity between the upscale neighborhood and the well-kept house and the young American woman dead in a vast swamp of her own blood. It had taken Eduardo years to get used to how much blood one body could produce. But he was used to it now, and he studied the scene with his practiced dissociative attitude, reminding himself that the best way to help this young woman now was to pay very close attention. Eduardo followed the police with his notepad. He did not touch anything. In the kitchen, they found a knife, which was collected. In the victim's drawer, they found a half-empty packet of skin condoms, which was also collected. In the bathroom, they found 3 discrete spots of blood, all of which were photographed, then sampled. In the garden, they found Lily Hayes, who had discovered the body, according to her, moments before running across the lawn with blood on her face, according to the driver, who was now shakily smoking a cigarette in front of his delivery truck. Lily Hayes was white, late teens or early 20s, with a squarish jaw and auburn hair and high, vaguely witchy eyebrows. She appeared to have already washed all of the blood off her face. She was standing morosely next to a very young man in suspenders. Behind them, the bald double pates of San Telmo Pedro gleamed in the distance. Lily Hayes was not crying. She was pale, but perhaps she was always pale. She kissed the boy once, somewhat chastely, and then again a little less chastely. She looked, Eduardo decided, harassed, inconvenienced, if she looked anything at all. There was a stillness to her face that would probably seem perverse under any circumstances, but especially these, and which could only be intentional. Eduardo let himself think the thought, and then he let it pass. He'd been at this long enough to know that you couldn't scour yourself entirely clean of hunches and biases and premonitions, lurking suspicions, knee-jerk reactions. You couldn't help but know some things without knowing why you knew them. But at that point, he did not know. He was not sure. And then I'm going to read just a couple of sentences from the very end of his chapter, Eduardo's. On Friday, the police brought in Lily Hayes' camera, and finally Eduardo was sure. Everything he really needed to know was in the pictures. In the pictures, the ease with which Lily Hayes floated through the universe was ruinously apparent. There simply was not an iota of friction between her desires and their arrival. Arise, world, she seemed to say, part seas, reveal yourself, Buenos Aires, and let me take your picture. On the camera was a picture of a woman with a blood-colored lesion on her face, clearly taken on the sly. There was a picture of a tiny pantsless boy. There was a picture of Lily Hayes herself, giving an exaggerated thumbs up as she points to her bug bites. Here, Eduardo saw was a person without humility. And Eduardo believed that humility, more than anything, was the basis for morality. Goodness begins when the Buberian I-it shifts to the ethically accountable I-thou. It begins with the belief that you do not have a monopoly on consciousness, that you are not, in fact, the only person who exists. And here's Lily Hayes standing in front of the basilica, her prodigious bosom spilling out over a too-tight tank top. She is nearly aglow with the light of her narcissism. Does she notice that all the other women are modestly dressed, that their heads are covered? She either does not notice or she does not care. A person who does not notice is silly. A person who does not care is dangerous. And when Eduardo looked at Lily Hayes' photos, he could see which kind of person she was. For whatever other qualities she had, Lily Hayes was not unobservant. She noticed everything. The pictures attested to this. Here she is noticing the wings of a dragonfly, and here she is noticing the dew on a guava fruit, and here she is noticing the hilarious discrepancy between an enormous sign advertising Comida Vegetariana alongside the butchered hide of some unfortunate ungulate glistening in the sun. What Lily Hayes noticed was gratingly predictable, perhaps, but she did notice. So Eduardo had to conclude, tentatively of course, that what she didn't do was care. That afternoon, Eduardo submitted his request to schedule the hearing before the instructor judge. He felt he had enough to say. I'll stop there. Thank you. So, we're doing a Q&A. Yeah, okay. So I guess we have a couple minutes if anyone has questions. So the question is about the genesis of the book and how the inspiration of the Amanda Knox case got transmuted into fiction. Yeah, I don't know how many of you guys all followed that case. It was a couple years back, but it got a lot of attention. This young woman on study abroad in Italy who was, I guess, convicted, acquitted, and then acquitted again of murdering her roommate. And what was really interesting to me about this case was not so much the details of the case or the murder itself, but the reactions that it inspired among people, because I noticed early on that people tended to be very divided on the question of this young woman's guilt or innocence, but very confident. So a lot of people felt strongly that she'd been clearly railroaded, and that this was like, that this was very tied into her being kind of this, that it was very tied into misogyny and feelings about female sexuality and anti-Americanism, and that this was very obvious. And an equal number of people seemed to feel very firmly that she was clearly this entitled sociopath that was this child of privilege, and I was very interested in how confident and diverse these opinions were, but also how they immediately became about something else. They were immediately about gender. They were immediately about privilege. They were immediately about anti-American resentment or American entitlement, and they were not so much actually about her or what actually happened. And so that was really what interested me in writing Cartwheel, was to try to think about that question of how do people, smart and well-intentioned people, look at the same person in the same situation and see wildly different things? And also how can a situation, can a person sort of serve as a blank slate onto which people's interpretations can become very inflected by bigger, broader issues that are really interesting and important, but are actually not actually salient to the question of whether somebody did or did not commit a specific crime. So that was sort of how I got going with Cartwheel.
She was permanently acquitted recently, right?
I don't know that you can be permanently. The question was she permanently acquitted? I'm not sure you can be, but I suspect she has been. Yes.
There's something about
they seem to
law that
they seem to be able to do it as long. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. It's just I was amazed, as I'm sure many American viewers of the case were, just that you could keep getting retried for the same thing. Because there were many kind of quirks of the differences between the U.S. and the Italian judicial system, which you don't necessarily, at least I didn't expect to be that different. And certain things, like the fact you could go through this 4 times, was who knew? So the question which I'm now going to just reductively summarize is basically, how did you pick the 4 points of view? Is that fair? No, sorry. Well, I knew early on that I wanted there to be, of course, somebody who was very structurally aligned with Lily. So somebody in her family who's going to kind of be initially very, very inclined to believe in her innocence and be committed to that view kind of regardless, or be very slow to possibly revise that view. A prosecutor, of course, being sort of the structural equivalent of somebody who's kind of, their job is to sort of maybe entertain this more, and then once this guy is professionally committed to that narrative, of course, he's going to be very slow to revise that. I wanted to include Lily's point of view, but I did not want to include her point of view up through the night of the murder. So I didn't want her point of view inclusion to answer the question of her guilt, but I wanted readers to feel that they knew her, that they'd had 100 pages to get to know her, and then they had to kind of decide themselves what they thought she did, 2 hours after her section ends. And then the fourth character, who is Sebastian, who's her sort of oddball neighbor and kind of quasi-romantic interest, was sort of served the function, I think, of somebody who was not pre-existingly structurally aligned, somebody who kind of gets to know her and kind of comes to his own conclusion. But also, I think one thing I enjoyed about Sebastian, who was just a really fun character for me to write in a lot of ways, but one thing I liked about him was that he kind of also gave Lily a chance to look at somebody and misunderstand them in the ways that she is very much sort of the object of that gaze, in the book, and I didn't want her to be only the object of a gaze that gets it incomplete, because we are all both, extending a flawed gaze towards everybody else and also being gazed at incompletely by everyone. And so I wanted her to be on both sides of that and have another character who was on both sides of that. So the question was sort of about inner narration and the transition between writing partial history, which is partly in first and partly in third, versus this one, which is all in third. So yeah, I think that with my first book, I felt that the first-person narrator's story was really very, very voice-driven. The other character had a lot of external event and had a storyline that extended through many, many years, whereas the first-person narrator had a much sort of smaller storyline in terms of the time and the scope. And I think that character kind of came to me initially through the voice, and so that was sort of why that book worked that way. This book. I think that it felt much more important in this book to sort of stick with, to not switch between first and third, because that necessarily would you would get like a more intimate kind of privileged access to one character versus the other. So it felt important to just try to do close third and try to get as close as possible. I tried really hard to just make all of the thirds sound as much like first as possible, which I think you kind of can do. But I wanted them to be equidistant, of course. And I think I would have had a really hard time doing 4 first persons, because I think they would have probably sounded all alike. I think that's really hard to do. Yeah, the question is about the setting in Argentina and whether I went there and how I did research. I actually did go there, but it was sort of before I had quite decided it was going to be the setting, so I sort of wish I had decided that before I'd gone, and then experienced that trip with an eye towards doing more research. But I had been there not long, while I was writing the book, essentially. So it certainly informed. The setting was kind of an interesting decision, because I wanted, of course, to it was very important to me that this book, and I don't know how well I succeeded, but I really wanted this book to not be scanned as about the Amanda Knox case, or some comment on the Amanda Knox, although it was very much inspired by these questions that arose for me. So moving it away from Italy was a very basic no-brainer, and I wanted it nowhere near Europe even. So then I was sort of looking where would an American student go and study abroad? Where might she fall in love with a place, but also kind of understand it in an incomplete way that could come back to kind of get her later? Where might she be very overly confident in her language skills? Being able to kind of negotiate your daily life is very different than being able to negotiate a judicial or legal conversation. And then the fact that it's also a Catholic country was something that felt like an important thing to possibly use. And then also the fact it came to feel this wasn't sort of how I decided, but I found myself using the sort of very fraught relationship and history between Argentina and the U.S. As part of sort of getting that broader question of how does this character serve as an archetypal figure, or a representation of something bigger than herself. So yeah, but in a fundamental way, I kind of feel like this book could kind of be set anywhere. I mean, not the exact events, but it's really much more concerned with how we view and kind of misunderstand each other. And so I really feel like the setting is more the brains of the characters than Argentina itself, which is really a contrast to my first book, where Russia felt like a very, very central, it couldn't have been anywhere else. And in this book, it was much more sort of incidental, I would say. So the question was sort of about what obligation or what responsibility I felt to the to sort of real life events, and how I, negotiated that, I guess. Yeah, I didn't feel any obligation to real life events, and I think maybe, I don't know, you guys are writers, so maybe you have the same problem. I believe so fully in fiction. I believe in it. I believe it exists. I believe that people make things up. I don't I'm not always suspecting people of really writing something that's really real. I believe in it. And I think that I was actually kind of naive with this book in writing that, because to me, it was how could 400 pages of somebody's inner monologue be not made up? I mean, to me, it's so obviously made up, but it's not always scanned that way. I mean, I've certainly gotten a lot of feedback of people who kind of take it as something that's posing as an account of real life events, which of course horrifies me, but is also, I think I was probably a little silly to not think that would happen, of course. So I didn't, while writing it, really feel any particular obligation. I was inspired by these questions I was really interested in, and so when there were, it was very similar. I mean, actually, the weird thing is this book is much farther from its inspiration than my first book, but because my first book was inspired by Garry Kasparov, a chess champion turned political dissident, nobody cares or like talks about it or notices. But with this one, you know, when there were little details I thought were kind of interesting, like the cartwheel that Amanda Knox was reported to have done, although then it turned out later that wasn't even true. But it was such a like fascinating detail because some people saw that as like, well, she's so guileless and whimsical, like nobody who's really guilty is going to do a cartwheel, like that's just so stupid, like of course you're not. And then other people were like, you know, you see the homicidal, you know, character at work in this cartwheel. And so things like that were like little details that I thought were just so interesting, I would sort of use, but you know, everything else was sort of invented. But yeah, it's an interesting question. It was definitely something I'm going to be thinking about differently, I think, if I ever do something similar again. Yeah. Well, so the question was sort of, did I have my own mind made up about Lily's guilt or innocence, and if so, how did I write from sort of the perspective of people who had the opposite? Well, I'm glad you thought it was convincing, or that it was. You know, I think that, you know, the line that Eduardo gets about like his job is to make the best case possible for the state. I think I kind of felt that way. I felt like I did feel like I knew myself as to whether Lily was guilty or innocent, but I felt that my job was to make the best case possible for both sides, and to, like, as much as possible, not try to privilege the viewpoint that I thought was correct, or to like, in some way let that viewpoint be more all-knowing or far-seeing, or more well-intentioned or more intelligent. So I tried very, very hard to give everybody, you know, kind of a fully inhabited way of looking at her that felt, I hope, smart and well-intentioned. And I really wanted everyone to be able to read the book and kind of see how that person came to that conclusion, even if they didn't have that conclusion themselves. I don't know how well I did, but I did try very hard. Yeah, this is a really interesting question about the use of foreign language in both books, Russian and Spanish. I have some familiarity. I mean, it's funny, I think I have about very poor equivalent like language knowledge in Spanish and Russian. Russian by like trying really hard, and Spanish just by accident, kind of, you know? Like I've taken like a little bit of Russian and have like a hard one, like, you know, 300 words. And yeah, you know, I don't know to what extent the, like, there's a question of like how much do you use it in the dialogue, but then there's also the question of like, we're assuming that this person's inner monologue is occurring in this foreign language, and that's like a kind of a harder question, because particularly with Eduardo, and this book was like kind of rushed to publication, and there are things that I think where he thinks in like an American idiomatic way, or speaks in a way that's, but I did try to, I mean, I did like revise with an eye towards that, and I tried to, and I found some and cut some, but I suspect some did get in. I don't know, it's a tricky thing, because I think you want to really, you know, capture somebody's like brain language as much as possible means something that's as natural and authentic to them. So I think that it feels quite stilted to try to do things like, you know, pretend that it's somehow been translated from another language back into English, since obviously that's not like how thinking works. But at the same time, if you start to use like expressions or idioms that are like not organic to that language speaker, that's a challenge. I don't know if that really answers your question, but my next book is set in New York, so I will not. Everyone is a native English speaker, and I will not be confronting this. So. Yeah, the questions about research, I think, and sort of how, like, where do you stop it? Like, how do you abandon or like move beyond research? Because I think you can get sort of bogged down in researching interminably. Yeah, you know, I think that like every book, you know, every book kind of seems to need a different approach to research. So it's kind of hard to like, you know, extrapolate into any kind of, you know, like policy about it. But with this book, I mean, what I tried to research as much as I could was the Argentinian judicial system, and like just how that works, and the setting, you know, to some degree. I certainly did not research the Amanda Knox case at all. Like by the time I started writing the book, I knew some stuff about it that had kind of gotten in. And then I tried to avoid it. I mean, it wasn't like a media blackout or anything, but like I didn't read the Wikipedia page. I didn't do anything like that until way after the book was published. So, but because, you know, I think you have to kind of know like what information is helpful to you to have and what information is not helpful. And for what I was trying to do here, like knowing more about the Amanda Knox case was not something that was ever going to be good for me to know. Like there was, you know, nothing I could, you know, once I'd gotten that question, I thought, you know, knowing more is not my friend in this because this is not really relevant. With my first book, Partial History, I think, you know, I worked really hard on researching the Russian aspect, you know, like life in Soviet Russia and post-Soviet Russia. That was the part that like a lot of research went into. What I didn't research as much was, so one of the characters in that book has a diagnosis of Huntington's disease, so she knows that in a few years' time she's going to start experiencing, you know, cognitive degeneration that will ultimately become fatal. And I researched the sort of pathological aspects of this disease, but I didn't really read people's first-person accounts of their own experiences with having this disease or dealing with this diagnosis. Which was because I wanted to write about somebody who did something that was not like the normal response, like not, you know, like not the thing that most people would do. So I kind of just wanted to look at, you know, what would this, like, could I get like something that felt plausible that this one particular person might have this response. And that was where I felt like that was my job, to imagine it and not to try to transpose somebody else's, you know, experience emotionally, but if that makes sense. Great. Well,
thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This is really wonderful.